Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalia Martin, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Happy New Year, everyone. It is officially our first webinar this year, and today's topic is a good one. We're going to talk about blind spots and threats that OT networks face today. Our panelist is Andrew Ginter, VP of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. And he'll dive into some of the biggest OT cyber threats and risks in 2025. Couple of notes before we start. This webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive an email with the link to the recording in the coming days. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please submit your questions in a Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and you can do it at any time during this session. We will try to answer all of your questions, but in case we're out of time, we'll make sure to reach out to you individually and answer it via email. One more thing I'd like to mention: if you have any questions about our solutions in general and would like to speak to one of our experts, I'm going to share a link in a chat box for your convenience, so you can contact us directly. And with that, Andrew, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And thank you to everybody for joining in. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to start with blind spots. These are consequences that historically we might not have regarded as credible threats. I'm going to spend some time on attacks and sort of the threat environment evolving to make these previously, let's say, unconsidered consequences credible threats. I'm going to talk about what is a credible threat, what are societal expectations, how is that evolving in terms of liability and expectations for decision makers like us who are designing security programs. And then I'm going to finish with an overview of some modern approaches to dealing with these very sophisticated threats and these nasty consequences. So consequences, blind spots, attacks, and then solutions. So let's get started here. Start with blind spots. I remember, I can't count how many times I've sat at a, in a conference. I do a lot of face-to-face events. And, a chief security officer has got up and explained, almost boasted about the strength of their industrial cybersecurity program. And, they have this measure in place and that measure in place. And it's clear, and, often they say it, the goal is reliable operation. Keep the lights on, keep gasoline coming out of the refinery, reliability. And I'm thinking, have you thought about safety? You've got a safety engineering team that's kind of, you've assumed they've dealt with that. You have focused on, cyber attacks that could temporarily shut down operations, cause an unplanned shutdown, which is, typically very expensive. You've ignored not a word about the possibility of damaging equipment. You figure the safety problem's solved, and, if you're aware of the equipment damage possibility at all, you figure that protective relays have us covered. Not a word about it. So, these are blind spots that I observe in sort of people's discussion and presumably the security programs as well. An executive from a power company, I don't know, a year and a half ago, was quoted as saying, look, in my industry, we can put up with disruption. Okay, we can put up with temporary outages. We don't like them. They cost us money. We cannot tolerate destruction, destroying very expensive, very important equipment that's going to take us, months or years to replace. Concrete examples. Misoperate a steam turbine and it shakes itself to pieces. Misoperate a pipeline and you send a hydraulic hammer down that ruptures the pipeline. It's a pressure wave in the pipeline. We assume that our software systems are set up to detect conditions that will damage our equipment. And a lot of these software systems are protective relays. This is a kind of software. I mean, safety instrumented systems are computers that have one focus, prevent catastrophe, prevent death and destruction, prevent destruction of the environment, safety. Protective relays have one job, dedicated computers with one job, prevent damage to very expensive equipment. Here's the problem. All of the protective relays are software. All software has defects. I wrote software for 20 years. Despite my best efforts and the best efforts of all of my very clever colleagues, every piece of production software we ever produced had bugs in it. Some of them we knew about and we were desperately trying to fix. Others we did not know about yet. Some of those bugs were security holes. In practice, all software has vulnerabilities. All software can be hacked, including, unfortunately, the software in our protective relays. So we're relying on software to protect the equipment, yet the software is vulnerable. Worse than that, if the bad guys get into our systems and, trick the CPU into writing zeros into the flash or the EEPROM that is our firmware, that is our operating system. If we zero out the operating system and reboot, the device gives up. It cannot reboot. It tries to execute zeros and goes nowhere. This is called bricking equipment. You erase the firmware so thoroughly that you cannot boot the machine up into a state where you can restore the firmware. Most industrial sites I see have, let's say they're using a model of PLC. They have 600 of these PLCs deployed in a large facility. They might have an inventory of spares of 200 or 300 of these PLCs because they buy them when they upgrade the facility, and then they know they're going to run these things for 20 years, and they know the vendor is not going to support them on the end of the 20 years. If they need to buy spares, they can't 20 years in. So they buy enough spares up front to replace equipment that fails sort of at random over the life of the installation. If we erase all the firmware on all 600 PLCs, our 300 spares are not enough to bring us back up. We go out to eBay and try and buy another 300 devices. It's not going to work. We shut down until we can reprogram all of our PLCs with the new versions. We're down for a long time. And it's not just PLCs. I mean, think smart meters. If you erase the firmware in 1 million smart meters, how are we going to get them back? These are our scenarios, that I just don't see considered. What we need to do is understand what is the worst that can happen to us. People talk about supply chain. Well, the world is changing. Russia has invaded the Ukraine, and bluntly, nobody trusts Russian equipment anymore. Nobody in the Western world is buying Russian equipment. What happens when China invades somebody? China invades Taiwan. Are we going to keep buying software from China? Are we going to trust a software update that comes from a Chinese vendor? No offense to the Chinese, but I'm sorry. The world of supply chain, the world of trust, which governments do we trust, is changing. Threats that, 20 years ago, people say, would I trust a vendor in China? Of course. Why are you asking this question? Would I trust a vendor in Russia? Well, 20 years ago was the beginning of, no, it was the end. It was 10 years into the end of the Cold War. Yeah, you might trust firmware updates from Russia. for many kinds of installations. This is all changing. The nature of the threat is changing. Um, you know, Today the internet is everywhere. We buy equipment that is connecting out to the internet, and the vendors go away. We cannot get updates for that equipment anymore. What are we going to do? These are problems that we never considered 20 years ago when we designed the systems that are automating our physical processes. But today we think about these. Why do we think about these things today? Because the threat environment's changed. Okay, the modern attack is something that you just didn't hear about in the 1990s. The modern attack is called pivoting. It's called targeted attack. Some people call it advanced persistent threat, which is a fancy word for pivoting. A pivoting attack compromises a machine. They get a foothold somewhere, and then they operate that machine by remote control. And they use the compromised machine to learn about the network it's in, to find other targets, and to attack other targets. Pivoting is using a compromised machine to attack other machines. This is the modern attack pattern. You can attack machines it's called east to west, other machines on the same network. You can attack machines north to south. You can go through a firewall to a more sensitive, more heavily protected network, find more valuable targets to attack, do it again to get into the OT network. Can these attacks break through firewalls? Well, this is the modern attack pattern. How many businesses were infected with ransomware last year on their IT networks, not the OT network, just on the IT networks? Thousands. Every one of those attacks broke through the IT to internet firewall, didn't it? Of course, these attacks can break through firewalls. It happens routinely. So this is the modern attack. This is a very effective attack pattern. It used to be called advanced persistent threats. Nowadays, people just call it pivoting because everyone does it. It's no longer advanced. It's the new normal. It's the threat we all have to worry about. If there's a pivoting path from the internet through compromised machines into our OT network, we're in deep trouble. Um, it gets worse. It gets worse. What happens if somebody pivots through a cloud? Um, Lots of OT networks are connected to industrial vendors. I'm not talking the Amazon cloud. I'm talking a connection to a trusted industrial vendor. What for? Predictive maintenance is the killer app. If the vendor can understand the how hard we're using the equipment, how much we've used the equipment, they can recommend optimal maintenance. They can save millions of dollars for the average site. They do remote support. They do remote management of their systems in our networks. All of it from the internet. Some of these vendors are heavily defended. Some of these vendors are less so. What happens if somebody breaks into one of these vendors, one of their systems that's connected to hundreds or thousands of industrial sites, gathering information about maintenance, doing support on the systems, updating the firmware, patching the systems? Well, if you compromise the vendor, you can send commands to the devices. You can send support commands. You can send new firmware. Not all systems are vulnerable to this, but inevitably in a large site, if we're using 30 vendors, 1 or 3 or 6 of these vendors are going to be designed this way. Now we've taken over the vendor system in the cloud. It doesn't have to be the heaviest defended vendor. It's the poorest defended vendor we've taken over. And we can pivot through the cloud. We can send our attack information, be it zeroed firmware, bricking stuff, be it, other kinds of commands. We can pivot into lots of other sites inside of encrypted connections. This is a kind of supply chain attack. It's not that someone has magically or, advanced blah, 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 inserted malware into the vendor's firmware. It's that the bad guys have taken over the vendor entirely. And now they're operating the vendor's equipment in our systems across encrypted connections to attack us. Here's an example of sort of state of the art. State of the art is something called Volt Typhoon. This is attributed to a Chinese nation-state intelligence agency, compromised over 50 U.S. utilities, some electric, some water is my understanding, but it was never really disclosed. They were using pivoting attacks. They'd taken over machines in the IT network, attacking other machines in the IT network, and mostly just sitting there. And the thing is, when they did their attacks, if you do an antivirus scan on these machines, it comes up completely clean, absolutely clean, because these attackers did not install a remote access Trojan. Remote access Trojan, a RAT, is a kind of malware that enables remote control. These attackers did not need a RAT. They're just using Windows. They're using Linux. These are very powerful, very, everything in the kitchen sink is in these operating systems. These attackers don't need a remote access Trojan. They use the facilities built into the operating system to operate them remotely and attack other systems. It's called living off the land. Again, run an antivirus on it and it comes up squeaky clean. There is absolutely no hint of malware on these machines, yet they're being operated by the adversary. This is called living off the land. Salt Typhoon, if you want to Google it, is another example of living off the land. Salt Typhoon is espionage, stealing information, targeting IT networks in telecom and other targets, stealing information, living off the land, extremely difficult to detect. Volt Typhoon was in utilities. Did Volt Typhoon cause any shutdowns? No. Did they break into the OT network? There was evidence at one of these sites. They had packet traces. They could see that the adversary got into the OT network and then pulled back, did nothing. To the best of the defenders' capabilities, and they had some very capable defenders in there. To the best of their knowledge, the Volt Typhoon folks did not steal gigabytes or terabytes of information. They did not sabotage anything. They had the ability to reach into OT and did not use that ability. They're just sitting there. Why? The consensus of U.S. intelligence agencies in a report that came out a couple of a year-ish ago, the consensus is that this lurking in the IT network, doing nothing but maintaining the ability to do something, this is a tactic. This is the adversary developing and maintaining the ability to act in the future whenever they feel like it, silently today. Living off the land has basically, it has, in a sense, is an attack on, three pillars of the NIST cybersecurity framework. The six pillars: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Detect, respond, and recover are directly attacked by living off the land. These are extremely difficult attacks to detect. What we need to understand as defenders is that we cannot use detect, respond, and recover as a proxy for protect. We need better protection to defeat this class of adversary. A little more threat information, a little more of the bad news. This is a preview of the Waterfall 2025 threat report that is coming out in about a month or 6 weeks. So sneak preview here. What we have in the data set for attacks in 2024 that had physical consequences, that shut things down, that damaged stuff, that there were 77 of these attacks affecting over 1,000 industrial sites. Most of these attacks affected multiple sites. As you can see, there's a big change in the threat environment since the beginning of the decade, since the turn of the decade, 2020. The blue, the dark on the bottom, is ransomware. It's increasing, but seems to have paused. The red is nation states. Nation state activity or nation state sponsored activity, hacktivist activity, some of it, has increased dramatically since the invasion of the Ukraine and since the atrocity, October 7th atrocity in Israel that triggered the war with Gaza. These physical conflicts have associated with a lot of hacktivist and nation state activity that deliberately targets OT systems and, in the statistics, brings about physical consequences. So, the world is changing threat-wise. The threats are becoming more sophisticated and more numerous. It gets worse. The malware that's out there, so Living Off the Land does not use malware, but once an adversary gets into the OT network, even if they're using Living Off the Land techniques, if they want to act to bring about a physical consequence, they might need to download a bit of malware. What's out there, what's been found in the wild is seven different kinds of malware that understand industrial systems and can manipulate industrial systems. Stuxnet targeted the Siemens S7 series PLCs. Havix was espionage. It was stealing information from OPC servers, among other things. InDestroyer could affect, 4 different protocols and was credited with turning off the power in Kiev at the behest of Russian adversaries. Triton was again attributed to a Russian nation state that sabotaged safety instrumented systems. Pipe Dream was a Swiss Army knife, all sorts of protocols and tools for industrial control system hacking. Cosmic Energy might have been a pen testing tool used in training Russian pen testers, white hat and or black hat. It hasn't been seen used in the wild, but it is, a capability that's out there. Frosty Goop similarly was remote access Trojan with a Modbus capability that was used to sabotage applications again in, I forget, Russia or the Ukraine. The last 3 here, Pipe Dream, Cosmic Energy, and Frosty Goop, came about in the last 3 years. Stuxnet through Triton, happened over the course of 10 or 11 years. In the last 3 years, we're seeing this, the rate of this class of attack that is capable of bringing about physical consequences, the rate is increasing. Oh, and by the way, attacks that bring about physical consequences, there's been a great many attacks that bring about physical consequences without even using industrial capable malware, just using conventional rats that, let you take over the screen and move the mouse and, wreak damage. Again, the frequency of nation state attacks is increasing. I was talking, and this is an episode of the Industrial Security Podcast that is out, was released, I think, a couple of weeks ago. I recommend it to you. This is Joseph Price from Deloitte. He's been active in the OT security space for a long time, for a handful of years, 5, 6. He was working for the government, studying nation-state threats. Now, a lot of the work he did was classified, but on the podcast, he gave us some insights. He said, "Look, Andrew, when you're looking at nation-state attacks," I asked him what nation states are held up as effectively infinite resources, infinite money, infinite time, infinite talent they can throw at the problem of attacking us. How can we defend against a nation state? And his answer was, well, the question is more complicated than that. Ask some different questions. He said, the first thing you have to remember about the history, the public record of nation state activity, the first thing you have to remember is that nation state militaries and nation state intelligence agencies are cheap. Okay. They are going to, if they have an objective, a military or a strategic objective, they are going to use the cheapest, stupidest, dumbest, simplest attacks that achieve their objective. He said, you can be certain that these agencies have more sophisticated stuff in their pocket. Whatever you've seen a nation state do to date, be certain they have more capable stuff in their pocket. Well, this is not good. It's not helping answer the question, what do we do about this? The second thing he said is some of what we see is nation states testing each other's defenses. Um, you know, they used a hacktivist class attack, no sophisticated stuff, basic stuff to break into a small water utility and what, I don't know, leak some water. Why would they do that? What's the point? He says, the point of some of this stuff is testing each other's defenses, testing each other's response capabilities. He gave the analogy. He said, Russian bombers, Russian fighter jets routinely come over the strait between Russia and Alaska, come to the edge of American airspace, and fly right along the edge. What happens? The Americans scramble fighter jets to go up and see what's going on, and track the enemy until they go back home. Why do you do that? You're testing your opponent's response capabilities. How long did it take them to detect you? How long did it take them to, get aircraft out to meet you? Which aircraft did they send? How capable were those aircraft? You're testing each other to figure out if there's a real conflict, what can we expect of the defenses of our opponents? He's suggesting the same thing happens in cyberspace. Many administrations around the world have announced a policy saying if somebody does a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, that is potentially an act of war. We will declare war. Well, someone just attacked a small water utility and leaked a little water. Did anyone declare war? Well, no. Well, what else? And how fast did the incident response team get there? And what did the incident response team do once they saw that we were in there? He said some of these actions are nation states testing each other's defenses, testing each other's response capabilities, testing, each other's willingness to escalate to a state of war or something else. He said, these are not attacks. These are, you get the right way to think about nation states is campaigns. These are campaigns. The question is not what's the goal of the attack. The question is how does the attack contribute to the campaign and what's the goal of the campaign? A question I asked of him was, look, he gave the analogy of sometimes you go with a big weapon, a massive aircraft carrier, and again, you park it right outside of territorial waters and you leave it there. It's a message to your opponent saying, we should talk about this. Let's do some diplomacy because we're right here. This is a big, powerful weapon, maybe two of them that we've parked right here. Let's talk about this. It's a tool of diplomacy, but that tool only works if you can see the weapon. So the question I asked of Joseph was, Volt Typhoon, living off the land, 50 sites were discovered. How likely is that it was a deliberate leak on the part of the Chinese to make, these were mostly American targets, to make the American administration aware that they had this capability? How likely is it that many other sites are compromised in a different way with different signatures so that, we still don't know that they're compromised, but they let us see these 50 as part of a diplomatic campaign to negotiate something or the other? And his answer was, that's a very good question. I'm no longer involved in the space, and even if I was, I couldn't answer it. Classified. But yeah, that's the right kind of question to ask about these nation state threats. So what do we do about this? One of the things we do about this is stop asking the question. I mean, a lot of us, we have an industrial site that says, "Hey, we got to do something about cybersecurity. Here's some budget, make it happen." And the first threat we look at is the highest frequency problem. Um, Errors and omissions. Technicians reboot the wrong PLC and trigger an unplanned shutdown. It's happened 3 times in the last 5 years. We should put permissions in place so that people can only reboot the PLCs that they have permission to reboot. They take the least consequential, highest frequency threats and spend the money on that. And when you get to the really big fish, well, the bad guys could come in and brick all of our PLCs and we'd be down for months. We don't have money for that. Oh, well, you spend the money on the least consequential and you wind up not having the budget to address the most consequential. Flip it around. What a lot of sites are doing today is starting with what is the worst case? What is the very worst that can happen? Things blow up, people die, all of our devices are bricked, our turbines tear themselves apart. And then they ask, what attack scenarios can bring about those consequences? And there's always attack scenarios that can bring them about. First law of cybersecurity, nothing is secure. Even if, even if we have IEC security level 4, 62443 security level 4 deployed everywhere, there are still opportunities to attack us. You can always imagine an attack, however complex, that will get through the defenses. What are those attack scenarios? And then, if there are attack scenarios, and sometimes there aren't, sometimes you've just designed the physical process. You've got an overpressure relief valve on the boiler. It can't blow up. Oh, if what are the worst consequences? Are there cyber attacks that could bring them about? And then the question is, those consequences that can be brought about by cyber attacks, are those consequences acceptable? Well, if the worst case consequence, if the worst thing we can imagine is going to cost us $1.5 million and the insurance company will pay us back, buy insurance. It's that simple. If the worst case is like a mass casualty event or critical infrastructure goes down for 9 months, that's probably not acceptable. And so this is the first step. Start with the big fish. Figure out how much trouble we're in. Look at the blind spots. Figure out whether there are attack scenarios that could bring these things about. And then ask the question, are they acceptable? And deal with the unacceptable first. So the attacks I've talked about here, when we look at what's possible, we have to look at the attack scenarios. We compare the strength of 2 security postures by which attacks do we defeat reliably with a high degree of confidence, and which threats remain that we do not defeat with a high degree of confidence. This is something sometimes in the physical security world, it's called the design basis threat. It is a statement of the most capable attack that we must defeat reliably. An embassy might be designed in a high-risk area, might be designed to defeat an attack by a terrorist cell of no more than 6 people armed with submachine guns and hand grenades. But not required to defeat, to protect the people in the embassy from a squadron of tanks that are driving down the street, blowing holes in buildings. Okay, the design basis threat says I defeat the terrorist cell, and everything sort of all the attacks above the line are out of scope. So what we have to do is look at attacks that have unacceptable consequences. We have to figure out which of these do we defeat with a very high degree of confidence, and which of them are we still exposed to. That's our design basis threat. And now we have to look at attacks above the line, attacks we do not defeat reliably, do we not defeat with a high degree of confidence, and ask the question, are those threats credible? Okay, is there reason to believe that this kind of attack will ever come after us? Does the Russian army have enough money to buy 3 cyber experts and plant them in the workforce of a small town. I was, raised in the town of Brooks, Alberta. 10,000 people in the middle of nowhere, literally an hour's drive from anywhere. Canada's a big place. Do the Russians have the money to buy 3 cyber experts, plant them in the workforce, and trigger them, the sleeper cell, 3 years later, and launch a catastrophic cyber attack on the water treatment system in the town of Brooks? Well, yeah, it might cost them $2, $3, $4 million to do that. Do they have the money? Of course they do. Is it reasonable to believe that this attack will ever come after the town of Brooks? It's an agricultural community. You cripple that community, and what have you gained? It makes no sense to launch that kind of attack against that kind of target. Is a sleeper cell like that a credible threat against the city of Washington, D.C.'s water treatment system? Well, most people will say, yes, actually it is. And so the first thing we do is, what are the attacks we're still exposed to? Where is the design basis threat? And then we ask, when we look above the design basis threat, are there still credible threats that we do not address with a high degree of confidence? And if there are such credible threats, what are we going to do about them? If one of those credible threats is realized, and I don't know, metros collide, these subways collide, and there's a mass casualty event, if that's ever realized, we as the defenders, the manager of the security program, the chief security officer of the transit company, is going to be called into court, is going to be called into investigations, and the question they're going to ask is, did you look at the attacks that were possible? Did you look at this as a consequence? Did you deem this attack to be a credible threat? And if not, why not? And if you did, what did you do about it? And why was that inadequate? How is what you've done reasonable? Increasingly today, I don't know this. I've never been a CISO in an owner and operator of critical infrastructure, but the CISOs I talk to, there seems to be a feeling out there that, look, when I come to work in the morning, one of the questions I ask is what do I need to do today to avoid getting fired? And another question I ask is, what do I need to do today to avoid going to jail? Because these serious consequences are becoming more credible. Not necessarily credible today, but becoming more credible. You look at the trend, what is reasonable to do today about these threats is the question we all need to start asking. One of the answers is cyber-informed engineering, something that is being done. An investigation by the Idaho National Laboratory is producing the methodology, funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Positions OT security as a coin with two sides. One side of the coin is security. Teach engineering teams about cyber threats. Teach them about credible threats. Teach them about security tools. Teach them about the intrinsic limitations of each of these security tools. How do you defeat signature-based antivirus? You write a new virus. There is no signature for it. Oh, teach the engineers how much trouble they're in, and they will demand better security. The other side of the coin is engineering. Use powerful engineering tools to address not just physical threats, but cyber threats. The overpressure relief valve on a boiler is not first and foremost, designed to protect the boiler against cyber attacks. It's designed so that if, I don't know, there's an earthquake and the output pipe, the steam that comes out of the boiler, that pipe is damaged and the steam cannot get through it anymore. The overpressure relief valve is there so the boiler doesn't blow up in an earthquake. The thing is that these powerful engineering tools to address physical risk, A, they're unhackable, and B, they can be used to address risk due to all sources, including cyber sources. So cyber formed engineering is saying, you don't choose one technique or the other. You do engineering to take as much as possible physical threat off the table. A lot of it's focused on safety. And not just and you do cybersecurity to address everything else, the residual risk, the credible threats that remain when you've taken everything you can practically take off the table already. So that's sort of the initiative. Here's one example of a methodology. Now, the CIE is a huge umbrella. Everything in cybersecurity and safety engineering, protection engineering, automation engineering, network engineering, all of these disciplines relevant to cybersecurity belong as part of CIE. Here is a specific tool that's part of CIE. It's called Security Process Hazard Analysis Review, Security PHA Review. A HAZOP is something that is legally mandated in a lot of jurisdictions, saying if you have a physical process that has safety risks, you have to go through and assess what are the consequences, the worst consequences we're trying to prevent. How could those consequences be triggered? How could they be brought about? And what mitigations do we have in place to eliminate that threat? The security PHA review adds a step to the process saying, once you've done all that, now ask for each of these truly unacceptable outcomes. Ask, can any of the trigger conditions be brought about by a cyber attack? And if they can, well, are all of our mitigations also cyber? If you can trigger the outcome with a cyber attack and you can break all of the cyber defenses because they're all software, well, then we have a problem. Then we need to do, really serious thinking about how are we going to prevent this outcome? Is the threat credible? Or we could put an extra overpressure relief valve in. We could put an extra electromechanical engineering design into the process. So this is sort of Security PHA Review. I very much recommend it. It's a book from the ISA. It's brilliantly written. Before I read it, I had no idea this existed, much less how to do it. When I closed the book, I said, wow, that's obvious. That's obviously the right way to do this. Brilliantly written. I recommend it. But an example of powerful tools that we have to address credible threats that we might not be addressing today. But here's the thing, the overpressure relief valve. When a cyber attack overheats the furnace under the boiler, when the relief valve engages, what happens? Well, the steam escapes. There's no explosion. Nobody dies. Yes, that's a win for the defenders. And 9 times out of 10, the plant operator lifts the cage on the big red mushroom button and hits the button and shuts down the power plant or the plant that's using the boiler. Why? Because that overpressure relief valve is the last ditch safety. All of the safety instrumented systems failed to detect the overpressure condition. All of the control systems failed to control the process in such a way as to prevent the overpressure condition. The last ditch safety saved our lives. What do? We shut this down and we try and figure out what just happened. How did that happen? And what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? And in the course of that, we've introduced a national security threat. What? Where did national security come from? All big infrastructure, essentially all big infrastructure, is critical national infrastructure. The legal definition of critical infrastructure is critical to the nation. How do we prevent threats to national security, to infrastructure that's critical to the nation? How do we prevent that? If the safeties are going to save our lives, but we have to prevent shutdowns. An emerging discipline is called network engineering. This is something I document in chapter 5 of my latest book. Free copies of the book are available, by the way, at the URL on the screen. You have to go and sign up because we have to get your shipping address if you want a copy of the book. We ship to most of the world, but not all. My apologies. What is network engineering? It is something we deploy at a criticality boundary, at a consequence boundary, at a connection between two networks with dramatically different worst-case consequences of compromise. Um, the the oh, what am I doing here? Sorry, I've confused myself as to where I am in the presentation. Um, okay, here we go. Right, I'm back. Sorry about that. You do it at consequence boundaries. Connection, what's the worst that happens on most IT networks? You encrypt 1,000 systems, you spend 3 weeks bringing it all back. It costs you $20 million. You can buy insurance for that. That's a business consequence. What's the worst consequence on many OT networks? The theoretically worst, well, things blow up and people die. At the connection between two networks with dramatically different worst case consequences of compromise, if we want to prevent the shutdown, if we want to prevent the attack getting into the OT network, we need engineering grade, deterministic prevention of the movement of attack information, of remote access Trojans from the IT network into the OT network. Chapter 5 in the book talks about a whole family of techniques. The most frequently used, all the techniques are in use, but the most common technique is something called a unidirectional security gateway. It's something that you deploy at a consequence boundary. It sends information from the OT network out to the IT network so that we can profit from understanding what's happening in our systems. We can get predictive maintenance and maintain our systems optimally. We can use the cloud systems, without risk to the OT systems. The gateway is a combination of hardware and software. The hardware is physically able to send information in only one direction. Think two circuit boards, one with a laser on it and one with a receiver and a short piece of fiber in between. You can send from one to the other, but it's not physically possible to send attack information back the other way. Why? Because there's no laser in the receiving circuit board. Oh, so we can send information out of OT and nothing can get back. And the software makes this stuff easy to deploy. It makes copies of industrial servers. So if we want to get, let's say, a GE steam turbines vibration information into the GE cloud system in Atlanta, where they have the expert systems and the AIs analyzing the vibrations and giving us advice on optimal maintenance. If we want to do that, where is that data in the GE turbine management system? It's in an iHistorian database. Oh, so the software logs into the database, username and password, nothing tricky, and asks for everything new in the last second since we logged in a second ago, and pushes that data out and on the IT network logs into a second GEI historian database, inserts the data into the database. So now we have the industrial database, the GEI historian, replicated out to the IT network. There's an iHistorian on the IT network that is right up to date, second by second, with all of the data in the industrial database. And that IT database, we can connect out to the cloud, we can connect out to the vendor can remote into it and draw conclusions about how to maintain our systems optimally without any possibility of attack information, remote access Trojans, passwords, stolen passwords, without any possibility of that kind of attack leaking back into the OT network. So this is the most common type of network engineering that we see out there. Where is network engineering deployed? It's deployed again, at a consequence boundary. The most common consequence boundary is the IT-OT interface, either the top or the bottom of the IT-OT DMZ. The second most common consequence boundary that we observe is between OT networks and the cloud, straight out to the internet. Increasingly, we see this in applications where you have a lot of edge devices, you have a lot of industrial internet activity, and you need to send your stuff out to the cloud without the possibility of attacks leaking back. And really, you don't want to burn 3 years getting approvals to run these connections straight out to the cloud through 7 layers of firewalls between the PLC networks and the cloud systems. What you want is a shortcut that's impenetrable. And this is the role of network engineering, to let the data move without the possibility, any possibility of attacks leaking back into OT networks. Society's changing, the threat environment's changing. This is my last slide, well, my second last slide. The threats continue to get worse. Attacks that were not credible in the past are credible now, and attacks that we're looking at are becoming credible in the next 1 or 2 or 4 years. We need to design our security programs to carry today's attack load, to carry an attack load until our next opportunity to upgrade those security systems. So we got to look into the future, and we got to design our automation to carry that threat load to the next opportunity to upgrade security with a large margin for error. This is the expectation. Blind spots, attacks that were not credible 20 years ago, are credible today. And we need to look at our designs and start using modern approaches to take entire categories of risk off the table. CIE does this. CIE teaches us, don't start with the highest frequency, lowest impact attacks. Start with the big fish. Figure out how much trouble we're in on the high end of the spectrum. And the defenses we put in place to address the big fish, a lot of those defenses address the small fry as well. Look at your leftover budget and see how to address your small fry after you've addressed the big fish. Societal expectations are changing. We as decision makers, the people who hold the budget, the purse strings for cybersecurity programs, increasingly need to think about what happens if there's a worst case condition. Which threats will the jury regard as credible? I was talking to another gentleman recently, again, on the Industrial Security Podcast. This episode hasn't even published yet, but it's coming out soon. And he said, look, Andrew, when I'm making these decisions, one of the thought experiments I do is I look at the consequence. I look at the nature of the attack that's needed to bring about the consequence. I ask, is that a credible threat? And I imagine that the consequence is realized, that the attack happened, the consequence is realized. And, I put defenses in place that were inadequate. I imagine that, 3 days after people died or things blew up, I imagine I'm sitting in the pub. It's the end of the week. It has been a really hard week for a lot of people. I'm sitting there with my beer. I've got my peers, my colleagues or my peers from other businesses. We meet on the Friday. We have a beer together. This is the pub test. The colleagues say, you had a really bad week. You say yes. And you explain, here was the situation. Here was what I decided. Here was what I put in place or did not put in place. What's the response of your colleagues in your thought experiment? How are they going to respond to your decision and the consequences of it? Are they going to say, well, what you did was perfectly reasonable. Nobody could have anticipated this. Or are they going to say, what were you thinking? How could you make that decision? Imagine their response. That's a clue as to whether we're making the right decision. So expectations are changing. Credible threats are becoming credible that weren't before. We need to respond by understanding the attacks, understanding the threats, by addressing the blind spots and acting on this knowledge. One more slide, if you will, 20 seconds. I work for Waterfall. Waterfall Security is an OT security company. We invented the unidirectional gateway. That's why I care so much about it. We are deployed all over the world. We have offices all over the world. We are trusted by critical infrastructures, critical industrial infrastructures all over the world. So this is Waterfall. And again, if you're interested in a copy of my latest book published a year ago, you can put your shipping address in and request a free copy at the URL, waterfall-security.com/engineering-grade-ot-security. So that's what I have for you. Natalia, how are we doing? Do we have any questions in the queue?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation, like always. Yes, we've got a few questions. We don't have a lot of time left, so let's take just a couple. So the first question is legacy ICS presented in your book?
Yes, absolutely. I argue in my book, I'll argue here, the phrase is misleading. In my experience, all ICS is legacy ICS. Imagine that we are building a brand new factory, a brand new power plant, a brand new whatever, brand new refinery. We get it all built, we test it all, and we commission it. It's producing for us. The day after we commission it, we have to start using the engineering change control protocol for managing our equipment. We cannot patch everything willy-nilly without testing it, without answering the question, will that patch kill anyone? We have to, because of the consequences, we have to, every industrial site has to be managed this way, which means every industrial site, the day it's commissioned, becomes legacy. We cannot patch it as willy-nilly. We cannot upgrade the software willy-nilly. We have to control change. Over time, it drifts more and more behind. Everything is legacy. This is the nature of OT. So yes, of course, this is what I talk about in the book. I talk about engineering change control. I talk about why IT is different from OT, and how you have to manage OT. And cyber-informed engineering, one of the principles is use, wherever possible, unhackable, subtle changes to the design of the physical process to take entire categories of physical threat off the table. Use network engineering, subtle changes to network designs to take entire categories of cyber threat off the table, and deploy a lot of cybersecurity beside to deal with everything that's left over. So yes, this is what you have to do for legacy systems. All OT systems, in my experience, are legacy. There's no such thing as I overgeneralize. I focus on high consequence sites. All of my examples here have been high consequence sites. I do point out in the book that if you're running a small shoe factory, if the safety threats have been dealt with electromechanically, if a shutdown is going to cost you $10 million and the insurance company will pay you back, maybe you don't need engineering change control on your automation system. You need it on your safety, but you may not need it on your automation system. And so you can, in fact, manage that kind of OT network as if it were an IT network. It doesn't have to be legacy, but high consequence stuff is what I'm talking about here. High consequence stuff, in my experience, is always legacy. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
Thank you. Next question. Are you seeing OT being completely separate from IT, or do you see IT supports that OT needs?
If we're talking about teams, if we're talking about people, it's all over the place. I see OT, I see engineering and automation teams reporting to IT, CIOs, working together, but in those tightly integrated organizations, there's a clear understanding of the difference between how you have to manage OT for high consequence installations and how you can manage IT the rest of the time. Whether the teams, and sometimes the teams are not. Sometimes the engineering and automation teams report to a COO, and the IT teams report to a CIO, and they have to work together. In both cases, these are different skill sets. In both cases, they have to work together. They have to appreciate each other's expertise. They have to understand the difference between the kinds of networks. Consequence drives management decisions, not technology. It can be the same technology on both networks, but because of the consequences, the worst case consequences of failure or compromise, these assets have to be managed differently. And that understanding is what's key, not who they report to.
Thank you. Well, let's take one more question. How do you compare data diodes to an MQTT blocker?
How do I compare a data diode to an MQTT broker? So an MQTT broker is a technology. So MQTT is a protocol. It's a publish subscribe protocol that's used, it becoming sort of the default for communications with the cloud. A broker is, in my limited understanding, is a tool that can talk to a bunch of MQTT clients and push the data down the road into other consumers of the data, the cloud usually, and potentially vice versa. Um, Again, I'm gonna make some guesses here because I've never actually configured an MQTT broker, but I'm guessing that you can configure the device to say you can gather data from the edge devices in the industrial network. You can send the data out to the cloud. I'm guessing you can configure the device saying, I don't care what's published in the cloud, nothing goes back into the OT network. I'm guessing you can configure that. And that's analogous to a data diode. And a data diode is defined by the NIST 883 standard as hardware that's physically able to send information in one direction. A unidirectional gateway is defined in that standard as hardware that can send information physically in one direction and making copies of servers. How is an MQTT broker different from a data diode or a unidirectional gateway from the one-way hardware? Well, with the one-way hardware, it does not matter how fancy the attack is. All cyber sabotage attacks are information. If physically no attack information can leak back into operations, it's all over. You cannot pivot an attack from the internet into operations. With MQTT, I'm sorry, it's software. All software has bugs. Some of those bugs are security holes. Some of those holes we know about and we're desperately trying to fix, the good guys. Some of those our enemies know about and are using against us without our knowledge. And so the difference is that if there is a vulnerability in the MQTT broker, and that vulnerability can be reached and exploited from the internet, from a pivoting path from the internet, you can pivot through the broker, the compromised broker, into the OT network. This is the difference between engineering grade hardware based protection and software based. A unidirectional gateway can have a connector that gathers MQTT data, pushes it through the weird hardware, and publishes that data out to the internet. It looks like a broker, but it physically cannot leak attack information back into the OT network. That's the difference. One is engineering grade protection and one is IT grade protection.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, unfortunately, we reached top of the hour and we have to wrap up. Anything you want to add? Any last word?
Oh, I just wanted to thank people, remind people that you're going to get a recording. So, don't worry about, can I get a copy of the slides? You get a recording. Remind people that the book is available. And, I am very much open to feedback. I'm first name dot last, Andrew.Ginter at waterfall-security. I'm on LinkedIn. If you heard something today that either you disagree with or you agree with or you want to talk about, That's what I do. So reach out. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for today. On behalf of Waterfall, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, Natalia.